NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
Welcome. This is Laura Schile with Pocket Expert Forensic Consulting. I would like to welcome all of you to the NACDL Making Sense of Forensic Science Seminar. This is the 13th annual seminar, and it's going to be special. We're at the Four Seasons live in Las Vegas. I'm so excited.
No. Nice try, though. No. We are having our QLEs, our Quarantine Legal Education, Credits Without Contacts, brought to you from home with a nice picture of Las Vegas in the background, I might add. Good try.
Well, that was my wife, my director, my cinematographer. Anyways, I guess that she's not going to let me have my little fun. We don't have a green screen. We just have a television. We're trying our best in a pandemic, and we're trying our best for you in a pandemic with NACDL, a bunch of brilliant speakers. And what we're going to try to do, what we are doing, is we are putting together a CLE, but we're calling it a QLE, trying to be cute, Quarantining Legal Education. Where you can get these CLE credits in the comfort of your own home, but we're not skimping on the information that we're bringing to you. We're bringing some great speakers in. We're bringing credits to you that are obtainable in home, in your office, wherever you are quarantining yourself. Or self-isolating. And so I'm just really excited about this. And I really appreciate all the speakers, all the guests that I will be speaking with. It's going to be a very informal. I don't have a suit or a jacket on like I would normally do for this type of event. We're going to keep it informal, but we're going to keep it informative. And that's what we're shooting for. I really want to thank all the upcoming speakers. I want to thank Gerald Lippert at NACDL and all of the staff at NACDL, and to thank NACDL for bringing this to all of you to help get credits in this very difficult time. Now, with that said, everybody's working hard to make sure that you all can still get information that you need to get the CLE credits. We are doing this all, nobody's getting paid. Nobody, unfortunately, is getting a room at the Four Seasons Hotel or the ability to gamble. So I would just ask that if anybody has a Flowbee, please send it in. My hair is so long and out of control. But that's enough about me. Let's go to our first interview and have some great time, a lot of fun. And if you want to add anything, if you want more CLEs on more topics, just email Pocket Expert. Go to my site, pocketexpert.net, and email us. And thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. This is Laura Schile, Pocket Expert. Forensic Consulting, LLC is my company. I did a little intro. Now I'm here with Tiffany Roy. Before we get to Tiffany, which I'm very excited about, I know that while you all are at home, you're probably reading, or you should be reading, one of the NACDL magazine that, by the way, I don't get. so I have to borrow it after friends have already read theirs. So if anybody would like to get me a subscription to that, I would be good with that. But I want to give a shout out to Gerald Lippert. He is the Associate Executive Director for the Legal Education and Professional Development. Now, Gerald is the person who is behind putting many of the NACDL CLEs together. If you look, or if you have looked, this is the schedule of the upcoming live CLEs. Unfortunately, many of them have been canceled. I know that they're trying very hard to get those going again. Like I had said earlier, that's what we're doing here today. And we're trying to do this during the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020. And because of people like my guest, Tiffany Roy, we are able to come into your homes or your offices or your bedrooms, wherever you are self-isolating. I will mention again that every now and then a cat may jump up. That is my live studio audience. And Tiffany may have some live studio audiences participating in her home as well. But let me get on to welcoming Tiffany Roy, who lives in West Palm Beach, Florida. And Tiffany has done a lot of amazing stuff. I'm going to let her kind of tell you about some of the things that she has done. But she has a company, ForensicAid. Sorry, I was getting there. It's all in the gray matter stuck up there somewhere. ForensicAid, thank you. But she is also in Broward County, I believe. They pulled thousands of case files. And you were one of the experts, or the expert, that went through all of those case files. Is that correct?
Well, it's not. So it was a systemic problem. So identified a really important systemic issue dealing with forensic mixtures, which have been really problematic in the last, I would say, 10 years or so. And so we identified that problem through several cases that I had, and then the accrediting body, stepped in and, assisted the lab in correcting their flawed methodologies. So I actually have not reviewed even a fraction of the cases that may have been affected by that issue. And I'm not sure that anyone at Broward did either, but they did notify many defendants, criminal defendants. Any criminal defendant that had forensic DNA involved in their case for a certain period of time, they sent out a Brady notification to let them know that there could be some problems. So it was a widespread issue.
I sure hope that they were able to, any of those cases were able to get a expert, that the defense brought an expert in. Unfortunately, I have a feeling that probably did not happen.
So there were some experts that were working in and around Broward that were assisting some of those defense attorneys, but those experts, I think, I feel like every expert has the things that they are really watching out closely for, and it's really framed a lot by their past experiences and what they know, and I think that some of the other experts may not have been as attuned to some of the issues that we're dealing with mixtures and the combined probability of inclusion and some of the statistical problems if they had not practiced recently. So if they weren't bench working scientists, then I think a lot of academic people would have a difficult time trying to identify some of the actual practitioner concerns. So I think that was the difference.
Well, and what I have seen, and I think that many of us have seen, is that a lot of, and nothing wrong with the academic practitioners, they just have never been in the lab and have never done and dealt with the stuff that we have when we were in labs. Now, you have a forensic consulting company, which is ForensicAid. What's the website to that? Is it forensicaid.com?
It's .net. So
.net. I had to get, I'm gonna shout out for me real quick. Mine's pocketexpert.net, and could not get the .com, still can't get the .com. But Tiffany Roy at ForensicAid.net, and all of your information will be on that website. Is that correct? And how to contact you?
yep.
Tell us a little bit more about you.
So my background is in forensic DNA. I started my career with the Massachusetts State Police in their crime laboratory, and I worked in their DNA and criminalistics units. And I was there for about 4.5 years, and then I moved into to a private laboratory in South Florida, and it was primarily DNA and serology at that point. And I worked there for several years. When I was at Massachusetts, I attended law school at night, and I earned my law degree in 2010, and I passed the Massachusetts bar in 2011, and then moved here shortly after that and worked at the private lab, and then was there for a few years and moved into teaching and consulting. So
Wow.
yeah, so a lot of different things. That's one of the things that I feel like I do really well, is that I have a really broad skill set that's really just kind of focused on forensics and criminal law. And so I'm helpful to do a lot of different things.
Well, and I think that you and I feel we feel very much the same about the issues of serology being very much still needed in 2020, and not just going straight to DNA. And I think that both of us have kind of, me probably a little bit more, but I think both of us has seen the change from a DNA analyst actually being a serologist, crime scene expert, and having multiple disciplines, being trained in multiple disciplines. And now we're just seeing it so specialized that the DNA analyst doesn't know may know the serology, may report the serology out, but just more often than not, just go straight to DNA and not to serology.
Yeah.
And forego that completely.
Yeah, I'm seeing that. I mean, it has a lot to do with, the workflow and Lean Six Sigma, and trying to work as many samples as possible and get to all these things. And I understand that, serology has, the serological tests that we have now have their limitations for sure. And, what information can be gleaned from them. And I'm really hopeful that in the future, we will be able to do more with body fluid analysis right alongside the DNA sample, using RNA and some methods that are currently being researched. There's some really great research going on, but that information is certainly helpful and vital in some cases. And we're going to talk about some of those today when we talk about DNA transfer. But a good example is like child sexual assault. The serology can be extremely important in those kinds of cases in helping to differentiate between an assault and transfer activity that sometimes happens in laundering and things like that. So, it definitely has a lot of value.
Well, and you mentioned RNA testing, which is completely, it is not unique. I was doing RNA when I was doing DNA breakage and repair for MD Anderson when I was a research scientist almost 30 years ago, or 30 years ago. I hate to say that, it's been that long, but I was doing RNA work as well. And now, we're seeing RNA, in fact, the very methodology that we use for our DNA analysis in the crime lab, that methodology, instead of deoxyribose nucleic acid, right? It's ribonucleic acid, which is RNA, and that is being used to test for COVID-19. And that is the testing, the PCR, the polymerase chain reaction. It's this exact same methodology that we're using in the forensic laboratory that they're talking about every time you turn the TV on for the testing. And many of the same companies, QIAGEN, for example, many of the same companies are doing high throughput testing utilizing the exact same, essentially, the exact same methodology that we use in forensic testing. So even with that, we may be learning things for our future serology needs for that and the identification of that. And so talking about COVID-19, you and I discussed it, and I think that it really sets up a very, really good example of how we as DNA analysts are trying to tell our lawyers and oftentimes the jurors and judges about transfer DNA and, you know, the transfer issues that happen. And when possibly a state laboratory person is on the stand and they say, you ask them if transfer is possible, and they say, I guess it's possible. And that's after somebody has supposedly touched a victim, doesn't matter where, you know, but touched the victim with force and friction. And so when you've got somebody on the stand that says, well, I guess it's possible, you know, you and I have spoken about, well, I think COVID-19 is a great example of transfer DNA. And I think you're going to talk about that. And you've got a presentation for us. And if it's okay, I'd like to let you take control, and we can get on to your presentation and talk about that, along with various other things that you've got to share with us.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, there's just a lot of similarity between, you know, how DNA would be transferred and how disease would be transferred. You know, the virus is being transferred. So we do see a lot of parallels. And as I was preparing this presentation, even some of the language was pretty similar. So I'll share the presentation.
Well, I know it is getting scary because we've got so much bad information going out. And so hopefully let's get some good, solid information for our viewers.
Today, we're talking about how DNA transfers. It's really similar to how a virus would transfer. And the modes of transfer for DNA, especially when we're referring to the droplets and the body fluids that will be harboring the virus, would also harbor DNA, possibly. So in the field, the area of research that deals with the ability of DNA to transfer is called DNA TPPR. And the TPPR stands for transfer, the ability of DNA to transfer directly and indirectly from direct contact, or once it's on an item that's been handled or touched by someone else, it can be transferred to anyone who comes into contact with that item. Also the ability of DNA to persist on an item or an object. And the same thing for the virus. We have been studying and hearing about how long it can live on steel and how long it can live on cardboard and how long it can stay alive on copper. So there are studies ongoing right now about COVID that we have studied in forensics to try to tell us, you know, how long can it be there and how much can we expect to find after certain periods of time. The second P is the prevalence of DNA to exist on an item. So that's about differentiating between what's normally there, what should be there, and what might be transferred as part of a crime or some activity that's related to a crime. And then the R stands for recovery. So the ability of scientists to recover the DNA and find the traces of DNA, sort of like what they're doing now when we're testing ventilators and we're testing hospital rooms, trying to find what surfaces this is transferring on that have come into contact with other individuals, how best to sample those, and what effect the sampling and the recovery process is going to have on the detection of the virus and DNA in forensics. So COVID, we know there are several modes of transfer. Certainly we know it can transfer in droplets. So the virus is contained in body fluids, and if someone coughs or sneezes or touches their face or their eyes and gets some body fluid that contains bacteria or rather virus on it and comes into contact with another individual, it can transfer in that way. And there's also been some studies where we're trying to determine whether or not DNA can be, the virus can be aerosolized. Can you hear that?
Yeah, but that's your live studio audience, so
Yeah.
it's okay. This is you're that's absolutely great.
A little distracted, but trying to stay focused.
Yep, you're doing a great job. Thank you.
Yes, so the virus can transfer in a number of different ways. We know for certain that it will transfer in body fluids, and so when we talk about body fluids, that's going to be akin to DNA. So if the virus can spread through someone coughing or sneezing, DNA can also be transferred when someone coughs or sneezes on an object. And so that's why I'm seeing some similarities in the language when we're talking about, how the virus is transferred and what factors are impacting how it can be transferred. And I have a quote here from one of the articles that I read where it talks about the droplets are going to be spread to people that are, mostly in close contact with infected individuals. But they're defining, how long it can persist or, the rates of infection. These are the same kinds of studies we would do in forensic DNA to see, how much is transferred, where the high contact areas. So all of these things, all of these body fluids that would contain the virus might also contain DNA. And we're taking, extra precautions now and trying to limit contact because it's almost like a universal acknowledgement of the fact that we know this happens. We know that the virus is spread this way. And I think it's funny. And I was mentioning to you earlier that, there's sort of like a resistance in the field to acknowledge that DNA could be transferred this way in crime scene evidence. Everyone's trying to, I guess, downplay what, how easy it is to do this and give some value to the evidence when really it's difficult to know if this is a result of primary transfer or secondary transfer, or if this could have been someone walking by and just sneezed on an item or coughed at the inconvenient time. The reaction to the virus has been very different than the industry reaction to the idea of transfer DNA on crime scene evidence, which I think is kind of funny.
Absolutely, and I think as you're going to the next slide and you're talking about persistence, the virus, one of the papers that I read, and certainly if a virus that contains RNA is spread through aerosolized mucus, body fluids, that it's not visible when you cough or sneeze. One of the papers that I read, it lasts 30 minutes in drop in the air. That's just in the air, and then it drops on something. And depending on what that surface is, depends on how long it stays there. Unlike DNA, they're talking about, in all these papers, they're talking about how long it is active to be able to get COVID, right? So it's active for 9 days on metal and glass and granite. On cardboard, it's active for less time. But this is all as far as the veracity, really, or the viability of the virus to infect another individual. Whereas DNA, once it's there, unless something comes along and takes it away. So I apologize for interrupting. That was just my 2 cents in interrupting you. I apologize.
No, it's an important point to make, is that, once the virus is no longer active, it doesn't mean that the virus isn't there anymore, and I think that's important for people to know, is like they hear, well, when we transfer this and it persists for 24 hours on X, surface, that doesn't mean that it just goes away after that. It just means you can't get infected by it. And that's the difference with DNA. It's not active, it's not actively infecting anyone or doing anything. So it's still going to be present. Just like the virus would probably still be present on these items, that are, if we were going to be testing for their RNA, we might be able to detect the viral, RNA, but, it's not going to be infectious after a certain point.
Exactly. But I had a pretrial interview it wasn't 2 weeks ago, probably 4 weeks ago. It was right when we started to get concerned about COVID, and I had flown out and had a pretrial interview, and the prosecutors met with me, and I had been hired by the defense. The prosecutors met with me, and they actually said, and this is 2020, a month ago, well, the DNA would have been dead by then. So there's no way. And I tried to explain that DNA does not die. It is, and sperm, it dies as an organism. It's not modal at a certain time, and it does die. But the DNA is within the nucleus of the cell that we're looking at, which never dies. And it can be maintained on a piece of cloth at the right temperature. And in cases, sometimes not even at the right temperature, but hopefully how it's stored indefinitely.
Right. Agreed. And even there's just so much misinformation that I think it's important, to use this opportunity to see the differences between how we're describing a virus that's transferred in body fluid versus DNA that's transferred in the same body fluids.
It's terrific. I mean, it's a horrible pandemic, and I hate that it's affecting everybody. I hate that it's affecting people's lives, literally killing people. It's affecting people's economic status, but it's a perfect teaching example of what you and I and other DNA analysts, it's what we talk about every day. And so it's a terrific example to use. I hate that it's sweeping across the globe like it is, but since it is, let's use it for our examples.
Exactly.
Let's get something out of it good.
And there is just so much similarity with even how the language of how we're discussing how long the virus will be present on an item and how long it will persist. I have a quote from one of the articles I read, and it talks about in one of the studies, they took 3 patients in their hospital rooms, and they were testing the surfaces and the air and the ventilation systems to see if they could detect live virus. And in the room of the 3rd patient, they determined that this patient shed more virus, and the virus particles were present in all of these other places. But I think all the time about, when you hear someone shedding more virus, these are the kinds of things that will affect when DNA can be transferred and shed at a crime scene. So it's very personal. It's personal to the people involved, and different people shed at different rates. And so I thought that language was really
so similar. And I read that exact same paper, and in the 3rd patient's room, on the doctor's shoe, on the very top of the shoe, they detected a virus. And so it does show, without the doctor having touched the shoe, it does show that it is airborne and it had fallen on the top of his shoe and was detected.
Yeah, all of these, these kinds of studies that they're doing to see how long it will live and how long it can persist and on what items. These are studies that have been performed in forensic DNA, and they've helped us to understand that transfer of DNA does occur, and how the mechanisms by which it can be transferred, and the amounts that it can be transferred, and the types of results it can produce. So all of these studies, really, to me, that I've been reading about COVID and all of the information we're learning from it, they do remind me of DNA transfer studies. And so it's a lot of the same language, a lot of the same concepts. We're looking at a lot of the same terms. And so that's the common link, that, we're talking about body fluids and biologicals, and both of these, fields, virology, and infectious disease, as well as forensic DNA, that's going to involve body fluids and, biologicals, and anything that's going to transfer in those body fluids, like saliva, when we're coughing or sneezing, that could potentially transfer the virus, and it could potentially transfer DNA.
Any mucus, any skin cells touching, all of that is the virus is there, and there's going to be more research on COVID-19 than we would ever see in the forensic community. But it's so it's so super similar as transfer that I think that you can rely a lot of, they correlate so well. And as, of course, as scientists, you and I don't necessarily go what is on the TV news reports, but we actually go to the papers and look at the papers that are actually published and peer reviewed. And that is, I want the viewers to realize that that's where a lot of this information is coming, is from the actual papers that have been published and peer reviewed, which right now there haven't been a lot of them, but by the end of this pandemic, if it does, which, after 7 days in my house, I want it to end now. But after this gets over and we get through it, we're going to see a tremendous amount of studies on the transfer of COVID, and we've got to correlate that back to our field. And I think exactly what you're saying.
And so I think that's what, sort of led to this discussion on transfer DNA and sort of what the research, the status of the research is. So when an attorney is dealing with issues of forensic science, where we're talking about how DNA could come to be on an item and what activities could have resulted in the evidence that we're seeing, all of these things are going to have to start and involve the body of research that's available. And there have been a lot of studies in recent years in the area of DNA TPPR, to see, how and when it transfers, when we can be sure of certain things that the DNA can be telling us about the activities that took place. So it should always start with the research. As scientists, we would always want to make sure that there's a few things that I encounter when I'm reviewing the testimony of scientists in forensics. And if they're going to be making statements that deal with DNA and its ability to transfer, it should always start with a thorough discussion of the relevant research, the limitations of the testing. You and I had talked earlier about storage and collection issues. I should involve their training experience if they have that, and also case context. So
human nature is such that we have a tendency to seek out technological solutions, and sometimes in our drive and our excitement with the technological solution, we can sometimes lose the fundamental basis.
This is Sheila Willis of NIST talking about transfer.
15 years after the first use of DNA in forensic science, there was the realization that DNA could be transferred onto surfaces and detected. And that really spawned a whole industry and interest in seeing where we could detect DNA and how we could detect DNA, that may have lost sight of the fact that the DNA is not particular about where and when it transfers. And because the DNA is so powerful, this is in itself a risk, because everybody can become so excited about probing the technology that they forget that actually maybe this sample wasn't relevant at all. So we need to be particularly careful. This information is so powerful that we need to be really confident and careful and sure that it's relevant to the event that we're investigating. And because of that, it's my contention that what we should be doing with forensic science is looking at a coherent narrative. It shouldn't be that one sample in isolation solves the case. And in my experience, you asked me earlier on about my experience in forensic science, and I had a lot of dealings with our police investigators and with our prosecutors indeed. And maybe it's the same anyway, but no sound prosecution is based on one finding, no matter how fantastic that finding is. We certainly shouldn't stop using DNA, one of the most powerful tools available to us in crime investigation. Maybe we need to pay more attention on a case basis rather than a sample basis, and to think of the totality of the case and the context of the case. Because we do need to mitigate these risks, but we couldn't possibly not get value from this amazing tool in crime investigation.
So I didn't play that through with the slideshow to know when that was how it was gonna play, but as soon as I tried to advance the slide, it just played it.
That was excellent.
Yeah, I love that. It's Sheila Willis from NIST. And she, when I was doing some of the research for this, I thought that was a good short clip to talk about why they're doing some of the research they're doing in this area of transfer, why it's important. And it's important because it can mean a lot or not a lot in the context of any criminal case. And so part of the reason I started to do, to collate, I guess, the research studies in the area of transfer, it dealt with a particular case that I had, and I had reached out to the people from NIST about their scientific foundation reviews to see if those were going to involve transfer and persistence studies, and if those were anywhere near complete. And John Butler told me that they were not, but he did forward me a study that was published in 2019 in FSI Genetics, and it was about DNA transfer and forensic science, and it reviewed all of the relevant literature that addressed as many aspects of how DNA would transfer in case-specific studies and research and scenarios, so that we could better understand, the results that we were obtaining and the value of those results. And so in a forensic context for lawyers, if there are scientists that are going to be testifying about the likelihood or unlikelihood of transfer, or any of the activities that would have resulted in those DNA findings, there's really a framework and a way to do that. And there are things that they should be saying and things that they should not be saying. And so this can be very important in a criminal case to ensure that the scientists are testifying within what is acceptable and drawing conclusions that are scientifically supported. So this is the paper for anyone that wants to look this up. This has every transfer article, every possible, research scenario. They tested, handshaking to see how much DNA was transferred. They tested holding an item, passing it off multiple times, DNA persistence on knives, every different kind of scenario and different kind of study that's involved, one specific, aspect of how DNA transfers is really included in this review. So
I'm going to, NACDL will be offering this paper as well as a couple other papers that I've got sent to Gerald. And this is part of the packet. This will be part of the packet that comes with this CLE. So if you're watching the CLE, you will have access to this paper, the 2015 paper from Kentucky, the handshaking one. Do you recall that one, Tiffany?
I'm not certain. I wouldn't know it as the Kentucky one, but there are several handshaking ones.
It may have been Indiana. It's not Kentucky. It's Indiana. University of Indiana did it. So it will be that one and a few others that will be in the materials from the CLE.
And the reason I love this one is because it's really comprehensive. So if you have, strange set of facts and you're really trying to see if this is likely or unlikely, or if this scenario, what happened in this scenario when we controlled it in the laboratory, did transfer occur, and what were the results that were seen when this particular scenario was studied. This article lists a lot of those things. A lot of those variables are studied in this research. So one of the graphics that's contained in the paper, it's just showing the differences between primary and indirect transfer. So primary is a person touching an item or bleeding on something and depositing their DNA on it through contact, or, primary deposition. An indirect transfer is me bleeding on something and then my child running through my blood and transferring it with her feet to wherever she walks, even though I hadn't been present in some of those places. So this is just a graphic that shows the difference between direct deposition, indirect deposition, and all of the stages in between, all the different vectors and the multi-step transfers that can occur, and interrupted pathways. And these are described by research in this paper, the different modes and methods and how many times in steps DNA has been seen to transfer. There were a lot of indirect transfer studies because that's an area that is ripe for study. A lot of scientists, I think there was a study that came from Connecticut sometime in the early 90s. It was published. The first author was Carl Ladd. And people use that study to say that, transfer doesn't really occur, that, they did it in this lab and then what didn't really happen. And that was like 20 years ago. And there's hundreds of papers now that are listed in this review that have demonstrated that it absolutely does happen, and all of the different ways and all of the different controlled scenarios where it has demonstrated in the laboratory that it's absolutely possible and common to occur in certain situations.
Well, and our technology has advanced, and the sensitivity that we're picking up, especially with YSTRs, the sensitivity, the amount of input DNA that is required to get a partial profile or even a full profile is so very, minute. And when I'm talking about minute, our target DNA is usually, 1 nanogram per microliter of DNA. And we're finding at, picograms, we're able to get partial and full profiles. So 20 years ago when Ladd did this, maybe we were looking at DQ alpha polymarker. Certainly RFLP would have never picked it up, but with the global filer and fusion and Y-filer, the sensitivity of these kits now are just amazing, and at the same time potentially problematic.
I think dovetails so well with what Sheila Willis was saying in that video, is that the technology, we've pushed it so far that it can detect, a few cells of DNA, 2-3 cells of DNA. We can detect partial profiles and some information. And, what does 2 or 3 cells really mean in the context of that case? Is it really important? And we really have to stop and consider, that 2 or 3 cells could have come to be on an item in a lot of different ways. And so,
what does a partial YSTR mean?
Right. I mean, you're starting from non-specific information that's not unique from person to person, and then you have even less information, that's even less specific. So
Exactly.
yeah, so it's really, when I describe partial information to attorneys, when you start with something that's nondescript anyway, that doesn't describe a person uniquely, I usually try to do this with physical descriptions. So YSTR profile is like a pretty general physical description, 6 foot tall, black male. There's going to still be other people in the population that are going to match that. Maybe you have some information about height, eye color, brown eye color, and you have, say, 5 physical characteristics. So people, it's not unique from person to person, but you could still match up to it if you find the right guy, but there are a lot of people who can match up to it. And then if you start subtracting from that non-specific information and you only have a partial physical description and it's black male, that's what we're really doing when we have partial YSTR profiles. They get less and less descript with the less information we are able to obtain. And so the value of that evidence is diminished the more partial it becomes. So, and this is a real concern when we're working with such small amounts of DNA.
Especially when the analyst will, it should never happen with WISE anyway. I think the PCAST report was very clear. And if not, the PCAST report did say it, as well as they didn't say it specifically to this, but they said it to all feature matching type disciplines, which this is, feature comparison disciplines in forensics. But NRC2, which I call it, which is a 2009 Strengthening Forensic in America Path Forward.
NRC2.
I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. Thank you. That's not going to be the first time that Tiffany corrects me today.
I just, all those reports are really important, but NAS was the real first.
Yes. The 2009 report that was actually a book, a blue book with gold lettering, but it's so important. Do not use the word match, people. A YSTR profile match signifies a uniqueness. PCAST talks about that. YSTRs are not unique to an individual. Regular STRs, just STRs, are unique. It can be unique if you have a full profile, but certainly, partial YSTRs, when an analyst says match on the stand in front of a jury, that's in my opinion, that's bad science to give that information in such a way.
It's strong language, and definitely the reason this whole discussion is focused on the fact that language is extremely important. When we're saying things are possible, things are probable, things are likely, it's unlikely that this, resulted in this DNA profile, this activity, you're getting into very dangerous subject matter area. You have to be extremely careful. You have to confirm that your scientists have read the proper literature. I find that a lot of the scientists are not familiar with the full body of literature that's on this subject matter area and transfer and persistence. And they're drawing from maybe some of their casework experience or the DNA results alone, and that's really not appropriate. So the whole reason we are having this discussion, focuses on the fact that language is important. Some of these studies that are described in the paper, I took 3 examples of the transfer ones. They have studies that show that blood or saliva from person A can be deposited on a surface. Surface 1 comes into contact with surface 2 and the DNA is transferred, and then the person's DNA, person A's DNA, is detected on surface 2 even though they didn't contact that surface. Another one was using skin cells. When you handle something with your bare hands, person A handled surface 1, came into contact with surface 2, and then lo and behold, person A's DNA is on surface 2, even though they didn't handle that. And so there are a lot of different studies that are described in the indirect transfer section of this paper that are really super helpful. There have been a lot of studies about indirect transfer, and even the ones that are described in this section of the paper are not, exhaustive. They talk in other sections about indirect transfer of DNA and studies involving that. So the final one, I thought, I love when they use casework examples, when they use case examples, when they're studying, this person held a knife and they use it every day in their kitchen, and then someone picks it up and handles it one time, and what are the chances we're going to see that person's DNA profile over the profile of the routine user. So there are a lot of different things that are tested. A lot of studies have been performed in this area. A lot more work is still necessary, but there are some interesting studies that might be specific to your case scenario or your case facts that are located in here.
Especially, again, I'm interrupting, I apologize, but especially major and minor profiles, they're finding that, and again, it depends on several variables, but you can be the person who has another person's DNA on their hand. You go into the kitchen, handle a butcher knife, and even though you've handled it, the person that never handled it still can come out as a major profile.
Right.
And so that is, all of that has to be interpreted so very carefully.
Right. And within a certain framework, I think it's important that there's another paper by Duncan Taylor from ESR where he discusses the framework on how to address activity level statements and assessments. And he does it in a mathematical framework using the Bayesian network. And I just think that if scientists are going to start making these kind of statements, they should really be following the suggestions. Van Oorschot talks about it in this paper about how those things should be done. And he references Duncan Taylor's paper and some of the other papers that have been published about activity level reporting. And so it's really important to try to hold your analysts, the analysts that are going to be presenting this evidence, to that kind of framework. Make sure they're considering all of the literature, even the literature that conflicts with, maybe the prosecution's theory of the case. You can't just pick and choose which papers you're going to rely on. You need to be really looking at the body of literature and what it's telling you, rather than just picking one paper that supports your theory and only presenting that. That's not a scientific analysis.
Exactly.
So there are a lot of things that affect the ability of DNA to transfer, especially indirectly. One of them is the substrate that is being contacted. We find just in general that some, textiles and things that are going to receive DNA and cells from hands or body fluid are going to be better. They're going to take on more DNA than something that maybe is non-porous and hard. So there's a lot of research that describes how the substrate and the surfaces are going to impact how much DNA is transferred. The actual biological material itself, whether it's a body fluid, whether it's been dried, a dried body fluid versus a wet body fluid, the freshness of the DNA, the biological material. There are studies that are described in this paper that talk about the source of the skin, that there are different parts of the hand that will transfer more DNA from the skin than other parts of the hand. So there's a lot of research in here that show the biological material being transferred also plays a role in whether, the propensity of it to transfer. Shutter status, which is something that's extremely hard to ascertain just by the common person, but we have documented in many studies that everyone's skin is unique, and people can give up more DNA than others. Their routines, their own personal biology can impact how much DNA is left behind on an item when they handle it or wear it. And then the manner of the contact. And this is something I think that you were talking about earlier, Laura, when you are handling an item and you handle it for 2 hours, or somebody picks it up and handles it once for a few seconds, obviously those are not the same thing, and the propensity to transfer is very different in both of those scenarios. So there's a lot of research showing how long the items are handled, how they're handled, how they're intended to be handled, and with what force they are handled. That can have a significant impact on the core factors that affect DNA transfer.
Well, and one of the things that the paper also said, which is very, very relevant to a lot of our attorneys watching this, especially our sexual assault attorneys, but not just them, but force and friction was also shown. The more force used and the more friction used caused more DNA to be transferred. Shutter status, I'm up in the air about it. I mean, I'm not up in the air about that it is occurring and it is a factor. I just think that it's very hard to do. It's just like, we don't have everybody's DNA in a database, right? And so we don't know who's a good shedder and who's a bad shedder. And so it's very hard to bring that up as information in court without knowing that. But I'm not suggesting that shedder status does not exist. It absolutely does. I agree with the scientific journals on that. But it's just so hard to see a scientist on the stand or a criminalist on the stand and try to insinuate perhaps that this person's DNA is not there because they are not a good shedder.
And, I think that's one of the things that the research is helpful in addressing, is just also to let us know that maybe sometimes we have to think about the worst case scenarios, or, especially when we're talking about making interpretations of major profiles and minor profiles and trying to draw information from those, that information can be skewed if we just change this one small thing. If this were true and this person is a shedder, then, maybe it makes it more likely that they could be, the major profile on something that they didn't handle because they left their DNA behind so much on a handshake. So I think that the research in that area is just to really extend caution, to analysts that are trying to draw conclusions in those kinds of areas. So,
and I think we'll know more soon because I think more research is being done. A friend of mine who works currently in a police laboratory was telling me that one of their analysts, poor guy, male analyst, who his DNA profile ends up everywhere. He is an extreme shedder, and he walks by a sample, and his DNA can be on it. I don't know how long he's going to last as a DNA analyst, but he's had to take so very many precautions being an analyst because his DNA is ending up in everything. So I think we're going to see more in that on that issue.
And I think the paper too, it talks a lot about, one of the other reasons I think the paper is good, just to, one, it's a list of everything that's been done and everything we know, but it's also a list of what we don't know and where we need to focus our studies going forward. And I think there's going to definitely be, it's a burgeoning area of research. So I agree 100%. And, we're going to learn more about it as things go on. And the body of literature is definitely going to grow in this area because they do identify some areas where we just don't know that much about it. And we really hadn't started to study it. I would say probably in the last 5 years, there's been a lot more research in this area. So that's 100% true. So the prevalence section, he covers several areas where he talks about distinguishing background noise from deposit. And this sometimes I think is important to know when in the beginning of DNA, I don't think we were taking samples that were controls, like substrate controls. And I think we've gotten away from doing that because we just don't have the manpower to take a control sample from something that we're going to be collecting from. And we just don't, it's very expensive. We're already overwhelmed with the crime scene samples. So we don't really take substrate controls anymore. But It's important to know, and there's a lot of cases where we would want to know this. And one of the examples that we talk about is child sexual assault. But when we're laundering clothes with a whole family, you know, and we're talking about YSTR profiles, you know, are we expecting to see a YSTR profile on a child's underwear that is being laundered with her male family members? And the answer in the research has shown us that yes, we will see that. In some cases, it's extremely sensitive testing, YSTRs, and we do know that DNA can transfer in those ways. So distinguishing from normal background, what comes from just laundering clothing, from actual deposit from a sexual assault, can be extremely hard in those cases. And then they did some studies about the prevalence of non-self DNA on hands, because we're constantly contacting people and shaking hands and touching doors and touching things that bear DNA from other individuals and transferring.
Not anymore.
All the door handles are going to be very clean.
That's right.
But so that's possible in that way. So they want to see what the background noise look like, how much foreign DNA exists on your hands at all times. And on the necks of women with children and families, and prevalence of non-self DNA on other parts of the body. On my children, you know, would you expect to find my DNA on some places of my children just from normal care and you know, everyday maintenance, and also fingernail samples, and when we would expect to see DNA from other family members. A lot of times with domestic homicides and things, they test the fingernails of a female victim, and they might find DNA under the nails of a related suspect or a husband suspect. And could that be from everyday activity, or is that indicative of a deposit, or, you know, from an altercation? So there are studies that deal with that. And then prevalence of non-self DNA on personal items. There was a body of literature that talked about how much DNA you would find on the clothing of your family members or from other individuals, on the steering wheels of your cars and things like that. So the reason we're studying the prevalence of DNA is to determine when the DNA profiles that we're recovering for scientific samples and forensic samples is meaningful, when can it indicate criminal activity, and when can it not indicate criminal activity, in what circumstances. And like we talked about with child sexual assault, there's a lot of research that's going on about when we might find foreign DNA on a child, or foreign DNA on a child's clothing, that might tell us when an assault occurred versus when just natural everyday life is transferring DNA from some of these individuals, because most child sexual assaults do involve people that live with the child or are related to the child.
And I apologize for breaking in again, but I have
the conversation. You're not breaking in.
Well, thank you. I've got a case right now that I feel very strongly, given the facts of the case, that the lab did know about, because they're still getting, and we can talk another day about bias, cognitive bias that is going on, but the laboratory knew the full situation. With that information, had I been, and back in the day when I was in the lab, you know, we knew all about the cases, and with that information, I would have done a substrate control. I would have taken a substrate control and tested it, as opposed to what this lab did. So what I'm doing now is we've gone back to the evidence, and I have sent the evidence out to do exactly what I would have done had I been the analyst working on it in the first place, because I feel very strongly we're going to find exactly what what the lab found, but we're going to find it in various other places because of the circumstances. So that is one thing that I think people listening to this can take away, is that if the crime laboratory has not done a substrate control, and there's indication of that, of the prevalence of DNA being on, or a mixture of DNA being on an item, that, you know, the expert that you have hired, that should be a suggestion, is to go ahead and if they think that a substrate control should have been done to give a better understanding of the evidence, then go ahead and do it.
No, and it is, you know, a concern. That's obviously why in physics we're even studying these issues. You know, we've documented and through research that these things can happen. So it's important knowledge to have as a scientist, and also it's important for the attorneys to know these things are possible too. Persistence of DNA, this is like what we were talking about the persistence of the virus to live on an item in different surfaces and how long it can live there. And like Laura said, it can persist for an extremely long period of time, indefinitely, if it's stored properly. And sometimes if it's stored not even ideally, but just minimally, you know, protected, it can persist for an extremely long time. But so I guess this is another thing, is how long, you know, how long between time periods and how much DNA has to be left behind, you know, in order to detect it, or the use of someone else who came after or before. So there are studies described in the paper that talk about the persistence of deposit over time without further use, you know, just the one-time use. And then you deposit the item somewhere and it stays there and is protected. Or persistence of deposit after continued use. Persistence of the original user after a use by another. So I always think about the knife scenario where someone's got a kitchen knife and it's in the butcher block in their house and they use it routinely, and then someone comes along, you know, a burglar comes in and, you know, grabs that knife and that's used in the crime, and what the chances are that you might detect that person over the routine user. We have a persistence of a temporary user after the original user resumes using the object, and that sometimes happens when we don't know what the value of that evidence isn't immediately obvious, and the family can go on, you know, living, and these things are continually used even after they've been used in a crime. And persistence after multiple users and on non-personal items, as well as persistence of sperm in the vaginal cavity. And I always find the persistence of sperm and the persistence of seminal fluid articles to be very helpful in trying to understand what things are possible and reasonable when we're talking about activity related to a sexual assault. So
well, and I'm sorry. Go on.
You're not sorry. You don't have to be.
I find it so very interesting. You know, as forensics develop, you know, it's still a fairly baby field, right? It's still in its infancy. And I've been saying that for the 25 plus years that I've been in it. But as are sexual assaults, not sexual assaults, they've been around longer than I have, but the persistence of or the time taking a sexual assault kit, a sane kit, a safe kit, whatever we're calling it these days, a SAC kit. You know, it used to be 24 hours after assault. Now, then it was 72 hours or 48 hours and 72 hours. And now there's papers that show spermatozoa present on cervical swabs for up to 2 weeks. The sexual assault community, the sexual assault nurse examiners, the forensic nurse examiners, the sexual assault forensic examiners, though they're if they're following the national guidelines, they've extended those. However, several of the different areas that SANEs are practicing in are not following those. And if it's been 96 hours, they're not taking the samples anymore. And so I feel that it's super duper necessary that as the knowledge of our ability to obtain DNA profiles and the sensitivity of the DNA and the stringency of the DNA becoming better, that all the other areas need to address taking samples after a longer period of time. And so we need to work very diligently, to make sure that all the samples should be collected, even, when maybe their protocols, try to get those protocols up to date.
Yeah, it's certainly an important area that they address. I mean, I think there's been a lot of focus about DNA transferring, and especially skin activity, right? Skin to skin, when our skin cell is going to transfer. But this was one of the areas where they carved it out, to specifically talk about this and to go through all the relevant literature and make sure to tell everybody what has been found and where you could find that information. So this paper was really, really helpful in identifying how long this stuff can persist. And then it described some of the other factors that impact the ability of DNA to transfer. They mentioned washing of hands and washing of all items, wearing clothing, wearing gloves that can sometimes impede transfer, washing clothing, activities between activities. If you're going to be doing something like, we've talked a lot about sexual assault and the activities that can happen between the time an assault occurs and between the sexual assault collection kit. There's a lot of life that happens there. There's, bathrooms and showers and swimming and lots of things that can happen. So all of those things can definitely affect the persistence and how long DNA can survive in those some certain places. And then they also there have been some studies that have dealt with flies and how flies eat blood and go different places and transfer that blood through their normal biological processes, or walk around in blood and then walk around in other places, and how they can be instrumental in transferring DNA, which I thought that was kind of interesting. They specifically focused on that blowfly.
And blowfly, both vomit and droppings from the blowfly, they're obtaining human DNA results from. One thing that has not been studied, which if I had a lab, I would be doing it now, is mosquitoes. Because we know that mosquitoes uptake, and that's how certain diseases, malaria and dengue, that's how diseases are transferred, and it's transferred through passing, the mosquito. So I think that would be super interesting, is to find out who the last person that mosquito, or how many people that mosquito had sucked their blood.
Yeah, in and around a crime scene. If you could find that would be interesting for sure.
Yeah.
Sounds like interesting work.
This is what we think about.
Yeah, this is what we find interesting, right?
Exactly.
With these people. Yep. So all of these things, are important aspects that are going to show what weight we can give to evidence. And another thing that impacts the results, that varies the results significantly. And I have a case right now where the sampling can significantly make a difference in what you're able to recover, in how much faith you can, and what information you can draw from those results. If an item is sampled in a way that's going to give you the best chance at recovering a body fluid or biological material from it, then maybe you can have more confidence in trying to make activity level assessments. But if it hasn't been properly sampled, or it's been sampled in a way where it doesn't give you the best chance at results, then that changes those things. So the paper talks about studies that have been performed by swabbing, using even different types of swabs made of different materials, and how that can affect recovery of DNA from items, and taking cuttings from clothing and other items versus swabbing what's on the top layer. They talked about tape lifting, and I know that one of the best methods of recovery for saliva is just involved a case that I had. They determined to be tape lifting. And so the methods of recovery are going to impact the results, and what information you can draw from those results. And there are certain crime types and scenarios where the recovery method should be informed by that information so that you can sample it in an appropriate way to get information that you're hoping to get.
And the method of recovery, they're also finding that the analysts are not, every analyst is different in how they're sampling and taking the sample. I know when I worked at Texas Department of Public Safety, in our 9-month training period, that we had to go through pipette testing, and make sure that our pipetting accuracy was spot on, or we didn't move out of training. So I was in training for 6 years, but no, it was I had already been in the lab, so my sampling technique and my pipetting technique was fine, but there was a lot of other people's that were plus and minus a significant percent. So that the analysts themselves actually come into play here.
Absolutely. And there's so many variables in those pre-analysis and in analysis stages. There's so many moving parts, all the different pieces of instrumentation, the different kits, the different pipettes and how closely and well they're calibrated, the analyst's abilities, even the methodologies. There's just so many different methodologies now. One of the the methods that I was reading about was in this study that they talked about were the casings. So fire projectiles and being able to recover DNA from those rather, swabbing them versus putting the whole thing into a big tube and just shaking it around and trying to get what you could get off and concentrating that. And so all of these different methods, there's a lot of different ways to do it. There's a lot of different ways, moving parts that have a significant impact on the recovery. It's not always reflective of what was there to be sampled. So all of these things are considered. There's been a lot of study. There has been a lot of study. There are a number of different papers that he talks about, but all of these things can significantly impact the meaning of that evidence.
Well, we were at a webinar together, a quite long webinar, probably not unlike this. But
no, it's not going to go on for 4 hours.
But Tiffany and I, we weren't together physically, but together we were social distancing on this webinar, and they spoke of success with getting a DNA profile from a cartridge, and where 25 plus years ago we never would have really, we were trying it, but we knew that we did not have much of a chance in recovery. That's different today. It really is, and recovering DNA from items like that, that is something that needs to be tried and gone after. And if it hasn't been done by the laboratory, and the lawyer wants it done, the defense lawyer wants it done to prove, or in this case, we're talking about defense lawyers, we're talking to defense lawyers. So if that's going to change the outcome, then get it done, and don't rely on that laboratory to say, oh, that's not going to be possible, there just isn't going to be enough DNA. That is not true at this time.
Right, and there have been advances in the methodology for doing that. There's been some significant study on how to increase the likelihood of being able to obtain results from those, samples that we've traditionally not been able to get DNA from. So, don't, as a matter of policy, certainly these laboratories are not doing it. Maybe they just don't ever test shell casings, and they never test them for DNA, but that doesn't mean it can't be done. And even other things like hair shafts now. Traditionally, we were not able to get DNA profiles from hair shafts. And there are kits now that are able to get nuclear DNA from hair shafts. So we don't have to do mitochondrial. Not all laboratories do that. And
Right.
there are a handful of laboratories that have those kits online, but it's still an option. It's still a possibility. So,
And most of the laboratories that the criminal defender is the criminal defense attorney is going to go to privately if the state lab won't do it, if they can't do it, if they don't have it validated online. The laboratories that you can go to, most of those laboratories will do it, and they'll talk, and they have it validated, and they'll talk to your expert if you've hired one, or you to talk about what method of recovery would you like us to utilize. And it's so important for the defense attorney to know that they've hired the right expert to be able to talk about those issues if a laboratory is needed to do further analysis.
right, you gotta get the guidance from somewhere. If your laboratory is not doing it, then they have to be able, your expert has to be able to work with the people who can and bring you to those resources. So that's one of the things that I think this study is super helpful in doing, showing you, you know, what kinds of things are possible, and what kinds of things are worth going forward with. You can learn a lot. But why is this all important? And we talked a lot about why is the language important? Why is the language that these analysts on the stand describing this evidence, why is that important? And it comes back to these activity level assessments and proposing certain activities, and what is probable and what is possible, and assessing those. This particular graphic came from the Duncan Taylor paper on activity level assessments. I think this is a 2018 paper. But generally in the United States, we describe source level propositions when we're talking about our DNA evidence. And some of the other countries, I think in New Zealand and maybe Australia, they've started to do more activity level assessments. And Duncan's paper outlines a methodology for how to do that, for standardizing that, and also what kinds of things need to be included in that. And we've talked about some of them here today, you know, a discussion of the literature, you know, an extensive and overarching discussion of the literature, as well as the limitations of the testing and doing it in hopefully a mathematical framework. But we here in the States are primarily discussing things on the source level, or subsource level. We're talking about the qualities of the profile, how many contributors there are to a mixture, whether there's a major and a minor, and then maybe if we have something that can match to a person, DNA profile, single source DNA profiles can match to another individual or who might be included as a potential contributor. But we're not really on the activity level here yet. And so when I hear analysts discussing activity, when their laboratories don't have a standard method for doing that, when they've not fully explained, you know, what the basis of their opinion is, when they've not had a discussion about the limitations of the testing and some of the things we've talked about, sampling methods and storage methods, then it becomes a real slippery slope, and you have to be very careful with what you allow them to say and what you'll allow opposing attorneys to say about the evidence as it's been presented. So there's a section of this research, the Van Oorschot research paper that I put at the very beginning, that describes activity level reporting. And it says activity level refers to the generally accepted hierarchy of propositions for evaluation of evidence in forensic science. We refer to this as an activity level reporting or activity level assessments for legibility. We wish to stress that whenever we refer to activity level reporting in this review, we discuss the evaluation of evidence given activity level propositions, and by no means do we wish to endorse the practice of commenting by experts on activities given their findings. Primary transfer is more likely given these results. So you have to be extremely careful about what these analysts are saying on the stand, because of what we know now about transfer. We're extremely careful when we're dealing with this virus in preventing all of these transfers from occurring. And we're acknowledging that in science and medicine. And now as a nation, we're inside our homes. I haven't left my house in 15 days. And this is an acknowledgement that this transfer can happen, and it does happen. We don't want it to happen in this instance, and we're taking extreme measures to prevent that. But I think the same kind of care and concern needs to be extended in the criminal realm, that the DNA in a crime scene can transfer in a similar fashion, in a similar mode. And what value does that truly have if you just have that one piece of evidence? Like Sheila Willis said, if that's all it is a DNA profile on an item that may or may not even be related to this crime, and how that DNA profile could have gotten there, that absolutely needs to be considered in criminal cases.
And she said that one DNA sample should not make a case. And how many cases have you had where that one DNA profile does make the case, and you're there helping out?
Yeah, I have one case right now, and it doesn't make sense to me, the series of events, and it's one rogue profile. And you do investigation trying to ascertain whether or not contamination can be an issue. Do you know who Lucas Anderson is? Do you know what that case is?
Absolutely. And I have shared, and now that you bring it up, let me put that in my notes to make sure that I share that article that I have as some of the materials for this CLE, because I think that is such a fabulous story of what happened to Mr. Anderson. And I think that every forensic scientist, whether you're defense force or that's what some people think of as.
Not offended.
I said it. I went ahead and said it. But actually, whether we're people who are trying to defend forensic science, because that's what I feel that we really are, as well as government scientists, they want, some of them want to defend it as well. There's some who don't. And I guess there's some defense experts that don't either, and who actually could wear that, red letter on their shirts. I'm not going to say that either Tiffany and I could do that. We're championing the science. We're trying to anyway. But I think that every single criminalist, DNA analyst, serologist, crime scene investigator, everybody should know about Lucas Anderson. So take that away.
Yeah, and that's just the thing. These things happen. There's some other great case examples of when transfer has affected crime scene samples. Erin Murphy talks about it in her book, Inside the Cell. There was another one at Stanford, Connecticut. At Yale University, there was a student who was murdered. And the individual, she was placed inside, I think, an air conditioning or heating duct. And when they recovered her body, they found male DNA in that area. And it was like a beautiful profile, uploaded it to CODIS. And when they identified who it was the person who had worked to build that heating duct. And he was dead at the time that the crime occurred. But I am certain that he would have been a suspect in that crime.
Absolutely. And then they would have stopped investigating.
Right. So,
but tell us about Lucas Anderson.
So Lucas Anderson, just generally what happened, he, I think, was homeless youth in California, had been, intoxicated, inebriated, and required medical treatment. And the EMTs treated him and transported him to the hospital, and then responded to a crime following that. And they maybe were
a high-profile murder.
Right. And so the EMTs and the medical staff may not have been aware of the propensity of DNA to transfer, and they weren't careful enough with some aspect of their medical equipment. But for the defense attorneys and people investigating whether or not that could have happened, that would not have ever been discovered. That was not something that was discovered by the hospital or the state. It was the defense putting together the dots that the same EMTs had responded to both crimes, and that, you know, he was already in the hospital at that time, so he could not have committed that crime.
And they actually believe that it was the pulse oximeter, which is that little clippy thing that goes onto your finger that takes your oxygen level, that monitors your oxygen level. So now every time I go to the doctor, I you know, they want to check that, and I'm like, have you guys, you know, sterilize that? Oh yeah, sure. Well, I take out my little Purell sanitizer and I do it myself. And that was before the COVID virus. So that's what kind of freaks we are to begin with. But after reading that, you know, I want to Purell everything. But yeah, anyway, to get back, sorry, tangent. They think that it was one finger on the oximeter. So you have one finger on the oximeter, and do you remember where his DNA showed up?
No, I don't. Offhand, I don't.
It was in the gloves that the perpetrators had put in the sink to start to wash. The nitrile or rubber gloves that they had put in the sink to start to wash. Somehow, and it very well may have been from an EMT glove that the EMT maybe had cast off in there, but his Anderson's profile or his DNA, that was where they're assuming that it came from, and that's not very much DNA activity. You figure that you have a pulse oximeter on there, there's not a lot of friction, there's not a lot of force. It's kind of clamped down on your finger, and that's it.
Right. It's not a cloth or a textile. It's a smooth, non-porous surface. But it, you know, it just goes to show that, you know, it's specific from person to person, but it absolutely happens. It's been documented to happen. We've documented it in this paper. There are literally hundreds of papers where these instances have been documented and studied for this purpose. So if you go into a courtroom and you hear an analyst that's trying to say that, you know, this couldn't be from transfer, or discuss any activity level assessments, it has to be done in this framework and keeping this information in mind, because I think the primary thing is you want this to be balanced, this assessment. You don't want people going in picking and choosing which transfer articles they want to rely on. You know, if they come up to me and they have LAD in their hand, like, right. You know what I mean? Like, okay, 20 years ago, and, you know, thousands of research studies later, you know, I understand why, you know, a prosecuting attorney might do this, and everybody, you know, attorneys have different professional obligations and they have different goals.
And ethical.
Right. But a scientist is different. You know, a scientist should not be picking and choosing which data we're relying on, and they should be willing and able to acknowledge all of these aspects. So these activity level assessments and testimony, they have to be balanced. You know, you should never see them, you know, there should be competing propositions about activity that are being assessed, and, you know, the likelihood of one over the other should be compared. It should be a comparison. They're competing propositions. You don't just pick one thing and go with it.
Think about Lucas Anderson. If he had not been in the hospital, and they couldn't prove he was in the hospital, and think about him presenting that story, or his defense, that's his defense, and he's presenting that story to the forensic analyst on the stand. And the forensic analyst, you and I both know this, the majority of the forensic analysts on the stand are going to say, no.
That's highly unlikely.
It's highly unlikely. I don't see that. Well, are you 100%? Well, no, I'm not 100%, but no, I would not expect that, right? Yep. And so we use that Lucas Anderson story with an analyst on the stand. I was at counsel table, and my lawyer took that article up. She says, yes, I'm familiar with the article. We asked her to explain. She doesn't remember, so the defense lawyer explained. And she went on to say, yeah, that happened, but that's a 1 in 100 million chance. And I'm like, really? You're giving a statistic on how often that could happen? That was incredible. I was not, I tried to prepare my lawyers what might be said as we go through the give and take of what might be said. I was almost on the floor in shock that she's going to give a statistic on a Lucas Anderson case that was in fact real, that she knew about, she had read, and she's saying that it's 1 in 100 million.
Right. I mean, and then those kinds of things, it's important in that instance for the attorneys to make the record clear. What is the basis for that opinion? Did you perform any calculations about that? In places like Australia and in New Zealand, and in some of the published articles, they talk about cases that have been overturned for those reasons, that the analysts, those types of pure opinion are not supported by good science, and they have no place in the courtroom. They can lead to miscarriages of justice and can be extremely misleading. And so that's why this framework has been developed to try to prevent that kind of speculation from coming into the courtroom. And it's the job of the attorney to just make sure they make that record clear. What are you basing that on? When I've seen analysts say crazy things on the stand, and sometimes they double down even when presented with other evidence, and you just make the record as clear as you can. You can't control that. And
well, and I completely 100% agree with you. I think one of the things I truly, and I've been talking about this for the last 5 years or so. I truly think that the new way to defend DNA cases is to have your expert at counsel table with you, because of the fluidity needed in the cross-examination of so many other people that were involved with the crime scene, with the collection, with the analysis itself, and with the testimony that is occurring right there. Whether there was a pretrial hearing that you have, testimony from, whether there was a grand jury that you have some testimony from, but not from the lab probably. But the testimony, the current actual testimony, when you can be as fluid as they are being, I think it helps a great deal. And the way to be fluid is when your expert, when something like that happens, after your expert falls down on the floor because they cannot believe they just heard something, that expert gets up and writes a whole series of the response. Because there's the defense attorneys are not forensic scientists, and they can't prepare for everything. They've got so much else on their plate that if you've got an expert there to help them be fluid in that horrible answer that they just got, then the record is preserved much better. And we also took her down a path. The defense attorney that I was working with, after that answer, took her down a path so rigid. I'm writing out 3x5 note cards, flinging them like ninja sword, the ninja stars. And he did a tremendous job. And ultimately, she looked horrible in the eyes of the jury after that response.
And I think one other thing that attorneys can do to prevent this from happening in this way is to prepare pretrial. I like to handle
Absolutely
activity level assessments. And if these analysts if I even have fear that they're going to try to be making those kinds of statements, then we will litigate that pretrial. And if it's not included in their report, it's not been technically reviewed. There are significant issues with them laying out what the foundation of that opinion is. And if their laboratory doesn't have a standardized methodology for them doing that, they're just winging it. And
and you get a lot of evidentiary harpoons, thrown right in there in the middle of trial. And sure, it can be remedied after the fact, but man, how great is it to not have to remedy it through an appeal or a post-conviction, to do it beforehand or during the trial, because you're ready, your expert is ready.
Yeah, trials and convictions are hard to overturn. So you don't want to have to make these corrections on the back end. It's better to address it ahead of time. In Florida, we have a deposition, and I am thankful for that. There's a lot of things that I would change about the justice system here, but that is one of the things that I think should be available in many other states. You should know exactly what that expert is going to say, because you've asked them what they're going to say, and they've told you what they're going to say. And if you don't think that it's within the bounds of good science, you have that opportunity to challenge it before it even gets said in a courtroom. And I recognize that a lot of jurisdictions don't have access to that, and it's harder to figure out what they're going to say because they just get up on the stand and do the thing.
With a state that does that, I go all across the country, and I get so frustrated with so many different states. I live in Arizona. I think Arizona is one of the worst states to be an expert in, a consulting expert. With that said, I absolutely agree. If you are allowed a pretrial interview with the expert, with the sexual assault nurse, utilize that pretrial, give them the papers that they should have been reading anyway, because when they're going to, get on the stand, in their first opening 10 minutes, part of their job duties, that's going to qualify them as an expert, they're going to say, oh, I keep up with the literature. Well, many of them don't, even though they testify to that. And your expert that the defense lawyers are hiring, they should be keeping up with, that's what we're paid to do. It's what the state labs are paid to do as well, but we're paid to keep up on it. I find that we do keep a very, very good hand on the literature. And so we can provide that to the lawyer before the pretrial interview, ask the lawyer to present that to the expert and say, would you please, if you haven't already, would you please read these prior to trial? And that way we can interview them on the articles that we want to get in anyway.
Yeah, and I even like doing that. I mean, sometimes giving them before deposition, giving them the paper just so they can be aware of it, it can backfire, because then they'll just pull some other piece of literature that says something different.
Usually LAD, but yes.
Yes. So, I sometimes won't give them that information until after we litigate it. So if we get into a pretrial hearing and they say that they're going to be making statements about the activity level, then I would rather go into a hearing and have them look unprepared, and then present these articles through my testimony and cross-examine them in hearing about this information, and try to keep those kinds of opinions out in that way. I always try to do it pre-trial. It's extremely hard for a jury to understand the complexities, the things we're talking about right now. When we use COVID as a real life example, it's a little easier to understand. But to make the argument that Lucas Anderson is a one-off, it's really, really difficult for us to overcome that, because the thing about forensic evidence is we don't know. We don't know what the origin of that evidence was. If we did, we would be able to say with certainty, oh, this came from the suspect, or this came from the victim, or this came from someone walking by and just sneezing on the evidence. We don't know that. We don't know the ground truth of those samples.
I think after today's CLE and us putting this with COVID-19, I think those days should be over. Lucas Anderson was not a one-off. We can, after Lucas Anderson, there's been probably 4 or 5 that have been reported. We don't know how many unreported this has happened.
Discovered,
Yeah. And so I think that once people start understanding what we've understood for a long time, is transfer and DNA transfer. I think the days of allowing the state expert on the stand to continue to say, it's possible, but I don't really expect it to happen. I think that their truth is going to have to come out now, because I think, just like CSI and the expectations of forensics, I hated it at first, and now I kind of like it, because I want people to have a high expectation of the forensic analyst, and so just like CSI, I think COVID-19, I think a lot more people, if we can put it in the correct perspective, which I believe you have very nicely today, I think that shows DNA transfer beautifully.
Yeah. I hope that people can use this personal knowledge. We learned a lot about cognitive bias in that talk we were in the other day, and everyone has to be able to draw from their own knowledge base. And this is going to be a great way to, everyone is experiencing this. So there's no one that's missed the boat. And
no, there's no juror that's going to be able to say, no, well, not in the next, 10 years or 20 years. There's no juror that's going to be able to say, no, I don't know. What are you talking about? COVID-19? That's not going to happen anymore. And so I think DNA transfer, when put in the context that we're doing it today, is absolutely terrific for handling DNA transfer cases.
That's the end of that slideshow.
Wow, that was fabulous. That was fabulous, Tiffany. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me come on and talk about it. It's a really interesting topic, and I think that it's demonstrated a lot of things that we have known for a long time, but maybe it's been hard for other people to truly understand how that can happen. So,
well, and one of the things that you brought up is the substrate and preservation on a substrate. One of the things that I always try to tell my lawyers when there's a discussion about a sample not lasting, and I had mentioned before the DA a month ago saying it would have been dead by then, so you wouldn't get anything. So there's still a lot of misinformation out there. One of the things that we do when we get a tube of blood from a victim or suspect, now we're getting buccal swabs, the buccal swabs, the cheek swabs, but in a homicide case where the medical examiner will collect a tube of blood, in cases before buccal swabs, what we would do is we got a tube of blood. The first thing we did with that tube of blood was take it out, put it on white non-bleached cotton, and we would put a dot of that. We'd make it's called a blood stain card, and it was we put the several microliters on this blood card. We'd put the name down, the case number, put it in an envelope, stick that in the freezer, and that is stored forever. So we used to store, and we still do, store blood on cotton cloth in the freezer, and that sample lasts forever.
yeah. No, and it's important to think about, these are all important topics for what we're doing, the storage and how long it can last. It can last forever on those samples. So,
well, I really appreciate you being here. I want to thank you personally for taking the time out of your day, even though you have been at home for 15 days. I know you're working on a lot of cases. You have one thing that I did not mention, Tiffany has done. It's I can't really compare it to, I know there's a Winery on, there's a Winery law book on, that's like the code of search warrant, search and seizure was written by Winery. That's a big book that the lawyers use. There's other books that you guys are, it's like Bibles to lawyers. There's
Black's Law Dictionary.
yeah, Black's Law, exactly. Well, to forensic scientists, we have a book by Saperstein. It was and I got it 30 years ago. I was handed to it or 25 years ago when I walked into the crime lab for training. And you learn Saperstein, you memorize it. When there's updates, you learn those. It is our Bible. And Tiffany has just participated in basically updating and our book, our Bible, Saperstein.
So, well,
if I could get a signed copy, I'd sure appreciate it. Look at that, criminalistics.
Yeah.
It used to be hard and brown.
yeah.
A simple brown cover was my first one.
And they don't even do it, I think, in soft cover anymore. I think they're just doing it in like a bound. Like, I think the more it gets shredded by the people who use it, the better it is for the publisher. And textbooks is a tough industry right now anyway. But so, yeah, it's publishing at the end of the month, the 13th edition of Criminalistics. That was a great project, and it's a great resource. So anyway.
And where is that gonna be out of?
So the publisher is Pearson Education. So you can get it on Amazon. I think you can already place orders for it if you're interested on Amazon.
Can you get it on your website?
I don't know if I have a link to it on my website, but that's a really great idea. That's something I'll get right on top of as soon as I get off this call.
I like to help. And in this day and age, if we have helped you, if we've helped any of you, you could send us a roll of toilet paper. I used to want drink coupons when we were in Vegas and having this. I give me drink coupons. Now we're just asking for a roll of toilet paper for anybody that has been helped by our CLE.
Don't do that.
I really, really hope that you all have enjoyed this presentation from Tiffany Roy from ForensicAid as much as I have, and I sure hope you all appreciate Tiffany's time as truly, honestly, Tiffany, I thank you very, very much for participating. I thank NACDL and all of the community out there that is helping during this virus, whether they're trying to get CLEs done for lawyers, for all the lawyers that are still working very diligently and hard on their cases. We've come together as a country, and I'm just so proud of all of us.